So hello, all of you killer mains. I know you're wondering. Well, Ruin's been nerfed. What are we gonna do? Well, today, I want to discuss perks that you can run as a substitute to Ruin. So the main reason why Ruin was run is because Ruin was the premier slowdown perk that enabled killers enough time to go around and actually get kills and chase people. And even though it could be cleansed in the first 15 seconds of the game, like all Hex Totems, Ruin has a unique and interesting place. Ruin was the most effective, because it was the only thing that actually really slowed generators down. It actually forced survivors to be skillful with generator actions. This is no longer the case. Ruin in its current state is trash. Hex Ruin, very rare hag perk, a hex that affects all survivor generator repair progress. All generators are affected by Hex Ruin. While a generator is not being repaired by a survivor, it automatically regresses at 200% of normal regression speed. To put this into perspective, the normal regression speed is a quarter charge per second. So, if you look at the survivors, how it takes 80 seconds to complete a generator, that's divided into charges, and that's what toolboxes use it. Well, looking at that 80-second time frame, a quarter charge a second means it takes 4 seconds for one charge to regress. New Ruin currently regresses a generator by half a charge a second. So every 2 seconds, the generator regresses by 1 second. The main issue with Hex Ruin is that it does not work, simply put. For one thing, it is still a Hex perk, which means it can be cleansed immediately. And the benefit it provides is not significant. Devour and Haunted Ground provide exposed effects. Huntress Lullaby has the no skill check warning that can cause you to fuck up and give away your location. Noed is an exposed effect. Third Seal is aura blindness. Hex Ruin doesn't have that. Hex Ruin just simply doesn't do anything unless you can get a survivor off a gen. Because there's no penalty for the survivor getting off the generator, there is no value to this perk. And as such, the main slowdown perk for killers is gone. So let's look at some perks and see what we can use. Before I do that, I will mention a lot of people have talked about Surveillance, and Ruin is still really good. And I agree with that. Surveillance is very good with Ruin. However, Surveillance is a very good secondary perk. It works very well with other perks in the game. By itself, it's not particularly great. The downside to running Ruin and Surveillance is that while you get a large amount of information based off survivors getting off generators, there is no incentive for a survivor to get off a generator unless you yourself as the killer chases them off. So on a killer such as the Race or a Mike, if you're at one generator, that means that survivors could be at any of the other 6 remaining generators and have no reason to get off for Ruin and Surveillance to work. And even then, Surveillance just gives you a notification as to what gens have been touched. You would be better off running Discordance, which provides a similar benefit. So let's talk about what we can run as a killer to negate the effects. Now, some people have told me that Bitter Murmur is indeed a decent perk to run. What Bitter Murmur does is it causes, every time a generator is fully repaired, survivors within 16 meters of that gen are revealed, and then 10 seconds when the last generator is completed for all survivors on the map. This, however, is a bit of a pro and con. The downside to Bitter Murmur is that you have to lose a generator to get a short-term aura reveal. To put that in perspective, the aura reveal that you have during the course of the game is 1 second longer than a barbecue and chili. Yeah. And you're risking losing a generator to get it. It can be good if you're planning on doing what is called the endgame build-up now. There's pretty much 2 strategies. One is what is called an early game snowball, which is trying to kill the survivors as quickly as possible before they can complete generators, highly unlikely, or to go for the endgame strat, which is to try and get the endgame collapse into play. Maybe you have Noad or Blood Warden, and you're able to do something. Well, Bitter Murmur doesn't really help that. Blood Warden is obviously an excellent perk to be running now that Ruin has been nerfed, because the generators are going to pop quickly. Blood Warden is quite possibly, I have it as an A tier meta perk on Killer. I think it's incredibly strong. There is a downside to Blood Warden. A, Blood Warden is countered by survivors not opening the exit gate. It only activates when the gate is open. So if a survivor does open the gate, that is a good thing, because it means, you know, survivors can get out. The downside is if anyone goes down and gets hooked, then Blood Warden activates. So Blood Warden by itself is usually pretty bad. You need something with Remember Me or Noad to try and slow them down a little bit more. However, Blood Warden can be very useful in an endgame build. It's not going to slow the game down until the gates have been opened. And if you know you have Blood Warden, you can time it incredibly well. If you time it at tier 3 Blood Warden, which is 60 seconds, with an end of game scenario where there's about a minute left on the clock, you basically have 60 seconds to get whatever kills you want, because they can't leave. Someone told me that Cruel Limits is a decent perk to run, because Cruel Limits, well, it blocks on... This serves the same purpose of Bitter Murmur. This is a reactionary perk rather than a proactive perk. As a killer, you want to... I don't want to say avoid running perks like this, because there are perks that have value to reacting, like Nurses is actually a reactionary perk, because you only get the effect once they start healing. So while that may seem like a bad idea, it's actually a very strong one. Cruel Limits is the opposite. Cruel Limits is garbage. I cannot recommend you running this. I would recommend Bitter Murmur over the Cruel Limits. Do not run that perk. So now we come to Dying Light. Dying Light, right now, is one of only 2 perks in the game for killers that actually slow down the generator repair speed. Now, Dying Light is very risk-reward. Let's understand why. First off, it is an obsession perk, which means that the enemy team is running a decisive. You will not know that they are running it because you have an obsession perk. Okay, small gripe, I can deal with that. Secondly, the obsession is not affected by this. That means that this perk will only affect 75% of the enemy team. The best way to understand Dying Light is to view it from a perk perspective. So you see we have these other 3 perks right here. Well, these are the 3 people who are not, who are affected by the Dying Light. And you see this one Dying Light right here? That's the obsession. That obsession not only gets a 33% action speed bonus to healing and unhooking, which is insane. You are basically giving the survivor botany knowledge or a leader for free, and that bonus stacks with other abilities. So having botany knowledge means that a survivor can heal another survivor up faster. That's not really good for you as a killer, because they're going to be healing a lot faster. However, the other survivors, the other 3 survivors, will get a 3% penalty to repair, healing, and sabotage for each token. Tokens are gained by hooking survivors other than the obsession. Now, this perk is incredibly a high-risk, high-reward balance. You have to note that this perk is only going to affect 3 of the 4 people. This bonus will only stay up as long as the obsession is alive. The obsession is not affected by it, and gets a massive bonus to altruism speed. Why would you run this? Well, because there's not a lot to slow the game down anymore. If you have to understand, this is a 3% per hook on the other people. If you were to have all 3 of the other survivors hooked twice, that would be 6 stacks, which is a 12% regression speed. Now, that is not particularly great, especially with something like Prove Thyself, but it's better than having nothing. A perk I want to talk about that I think a lot of people underrate, Franklin's Demise, is one of the best ways for countering toolboxes. As annoying as a perk as it is to go up against, Franklin's Demise makes it so that you're not you know, getting gen rushed by toolboxes as much. And it does help them lose some of the amounts of charges. The next perk we're going to be talking about are the Hex perks. We're going to talk about Devour. Now, Devour has always been high risk, high reward. A lot of killers run Devour now because Ruin's gone and they still want to have that Hex totem in there because of the power of Devour Hope. I've run Devour in multiple games lately. Some have worked, some have not. I got a 5-stat game of Devour, and I had it cleansed before I even got a single stack. So, it does swing both ways, is that high risk, high reward. The downside, the upside to Devour, is that it allows you to end the game quickly. The downside is it doesn't do it with gen slowdown. This perk actually does nothing to slow the game down, believe it or not. What it does is it allows you to end it. See, at 3 tokens of Devour Hope, which is already helping, you only get tokens when a survivor gets rescued from the hook and you're 24 meters away. The beauty of Devour is that they are already closer to being dead, which is good for you. When you get your 3rd token of Devour Hope, it means that you are going to get the exposed effect on every survivor, similar to Noed. However, you don't have to be in the end game for this to activate. And if you can get 5 tokens, you get access to Moris. So on top of the survivors being insta-down and Moriable, this enables you to end the game very early. That's the risk-reward. The downside to it is it doesn't slow the game down at all, which means if the survivors are gen rushing as quickly as you are getting tokens, by the time they get to the end game, you may have your Devour active, which by that point it may be too late. If you have 3 tokens on Devour Hope, it's nothing. It's essentially the same as Noed. If you can get to 5 tokens, that's a bit more meaningful. You might get a Mori or 2 out of it, but that's it. Haunted Ground, I've heard Haunted Ground could potentially be a replacement to Ruin. It's not. It serves a different purpose. If you're using it for that 60-second window, it's not going to be like that. It is a protection perk for other hexes. Which brings us to Huntress Lullaby. Huntress Lullaby is, right now, one of the stronger perks to run in place of Ruin. It provides a similar effect. When a survivor misses a skill check, there's an automatic regression. And it does retain that skill-based element in that survivors need to pay attention to the screen with skill checks because the timer between the warnings gets shorter and shorter and shorter and shorter until it disappears. The downside to Huntress Lullaby is it gets cleansed before you even have a single stack to it, and survivors are immediately notified of its existence when they get on a generator. I think this type of hand-holding isn't really necessary. I think all of the Hex perks should work in a similar fashion to how Devour does. You don't know Devour Hope is in play until the first person goes down with the 3rd stack of the exposed effect. I think Huntress should be the same way. Until she gets her first token, you should not get a notification as a survivor that it's even in play. And it works similar to Ruin in that a killer has to work for it to get it. A killer has to be proactive in getting hooks in order to get the stacks of Huntress Lullaby up. The downside, obviously, is a Hex perk and it gets cleansed. Noed? I'm sorry, it's a thing. No one is such a strong perk because it gives the killer the exposed effect until they cleanse the totem at the end of the game when the survivors think they're safe. This is going to become a lot popular. And I understand why killers run it, because there is no way to slow gens down, so this is another reactionary perk that you have to have, similar to Blood Warden. Because this is going to be a perk you're going to need to run if you want to secure kills in the game. We've already talked about Ruin, so there's no point to talking about Ruin. I wouldn't really consider the rest of these perks slowdown perks. People have made an argument for Mindbreaker. This does nothing to slow gen speed. I think Mindbreaker would be better if instead of... And this is something I maybe shouldn't discuss. I should discuss this in a separate video. But I think Mindbreaker would work better if repair speeds were slower for survivors who are affected by certain conditions. Like, for example, exhaustion. If you're affected with the exhaustion status effect, your repair speed is 15% slower. And if you were affected with something like mangled or hemorrhage, you know, it's 10% slower. And if you're affected with something like blindness, then it's 5% slower. Basically, you could make it so that the severity of the penalty is based off of what type of affliction you have, rather than just giving survivors exhaustion. Blood Echo does this job better. They literally released a killer in the next patch that does a better job of this same effect. So, I wouldn't consider it a slowdown perk. Next, we have Overcharge. And now, Overcharge is one of those perks I see a lot of people running with something like Ruin. I want to let you all know, Ruin does not work with Overcharge, Pop, and Surge. You cannot run it with those 3 perks, which we will be discussing. So, if you're thinking, well, I can slap on, you know, Ultimate Gen Regression, doesn't work like that. You need them to cleanse the Ruin before these are a thing, and when I know there's Ruin in play, I don't cleanse it. There's no reason to cleanse it. It's a half charge a second. That means it takes 2 seconds for the generator to regress 1 second. I can deal with that. What Overcharge does is when you kick a generator, this next survivor to touch it gets a tremendously difficult skill check, and failing that skill check results in an additional gen regression. Now, obviously, good players can completely counter this by hitting the skill check. I ran it just yesterday. I didn't get any value out of it. They didn't miss a single skill check on it. So, kudos. It may seem like a wasted perk, but it is actually pretty effective. If you can get teams, if you're able to pinball effectively on a stealth killer where it forces the survivor to pay attention, they may fuck up the skill check because of the size of it. It can get some use. It's just not particularly great. I think it needs to be paired with another perk to really become effective, and that's the downside to it. The next perk we have is a gen slowdown, being Pop Goes the Weasel. This activates only after you hook another survivor. The next generator you break within 40 to 60 seconds will be regressed by 25%. Now, there is 2 schools of thought. One is that you instantly regress down the generator that is a relatively low, let's say it's under 40%, you know, you can bring that to basically nothing, or to regress a generator that's almost complete, that's like at 90%, and regress that back down. I am of the school of thought that it is better to regress the lower generator to set it back to nothing, rather than to regress the generator with a lot of health to it. The gen with a lot of health, most survivors are not really going to leave. They're going to want to stay and complete that gen. They're willing to die to complete the gen sometimes. So it's better not to pop that, because you're wasting a pop on something that's already going to be repaired back to that level by the time you come back to check on it. If you go to check on another gen and then come back, it's already been fixed. The thing for me is to regress a gen that's like part of the way, regress that down further, stamp that out, and force them to choose between, do I stay and work on this gen that I know the killer is patrolling, or do I go and do another gen that I know has no progress on it? It makes them waste more time, and that's what Pop Goes the Weasel does. It makes survivors waste slightly more time. Now, that can be considered a slowdown, but it actually does nothing in and of itself to slow the game down. It just makes it slightly more time-consuming for survivors. However, it is the meta perk right now. It is the #1 perk for gen slowdown, because there's nothing else out there. Because Ruin is gone, there's now this giant void. Rancor is an interesting perk, and we're going to be talking about some Rancor today. Rancor is similar to Noed and Devour. It's like if Noed and Devour had a baby. The difference is it only affects one person. That one person gets to see you, which isn't that big of a deal. It's like Object of Obsession. You get to see all survivors' locations for 3 seconds when a gen pops, which is good notification, so it has a little bit of bitter murmur attached to it. And then at the end of the game, once all the generators are completed, the Obsession has the exposed effect and you get to Mori them. What this means is it's kind of a reward in the endgame. If you got to the endgame state, hey, you get a free Mori. It's an incident and a Mori if you need it. Have fun. Not really a slowdown perk, but it's a good endgame perk, and you gotta talk about that. I am going to be talking about Remember Me. I think a lot of people don't really understand the value of Remember Me. I need to just put something here over I keep having this problem. Remember Me makes it so that if you hit your obsession 4 times, you increase the amount of time it takes to open the exit gates by double, which is nice. Now, the downside is it's very similar to Dying Light, and the obsession is not affected by Remember Me. Now, obviously, if the obsession's dead, that doesn't really matter. I mean, they're not going to be alive to open the gate. However, this perk becomes more critical if you're trying to get a Blood Warden, Noed type build in play. This is the perk you want to run. And I think that's really the key to all this. This is the perk you want to run. This is the perk you're going to get the most value out of if you're trying to slow the gates. There's nothing else to slow the gate. This has pretty much been the only perk that you have that slows gates down. And that's pretty much what it's there for. If you don't want to run Dying Light because, you know, you don't like how the perk really operates, how you have to get hooked for it, this is a much easier way to slow the game down, but you have to note, it's not really going to annoy most survivors unless you're able to apply pressure at a gate. If the gates are right next to each other, you'll get some value out of this perk. Other than that, you won't. So Thanatophobia is the next perk we need to cover. This is the other actual gen slowdown. What this does is it affects repair, healing, and sabotage speeds and slows them down by up to 16% based off the amount of survivors that you have injured. So, for every injured, dying, or hooked survivor, the survivors receive a penalty of up to 4% per survivor. There's 4 survivors, hence 16%. This perk by itself is weak. I think if it had a flat bonus, like for every survivor in a match that is dead, if there was like a 2% static bonus, I would appreciate that more, just to buff the perk a little bit. Right now, it's not really that effective. The key to this perk is you have to pair it with something like Sloppy Butcher in order to slow down the healing speed. Because if you're able to slow down their healing speed, which will take it longer for them to heal, and the Thanatophobia is more effective, it takes it longer for them to heal, it may discourage them from healing, which lets the Thana work. Right now, Thana only really works on killers who are able to get people injured and keep them injured. Something like a Plague, something like a Legion. These are killers that you're not really going to heal against because for one, you'd have to cleanse, and the other one, you just spend so much time mending and healing, it's not really worth it all the time. So, I would say Thana is probably stronger. It requires less work than Dying Light because you just have to keep them injured. But the benefit is also not as great because they can remove it just by healing. It is your premium perk, though, for that. Thrilling Tremors, I do think is a gen slowdown perk. The key on this is that when you pick up a survivor, the generators get blocked for 16 seconds. Now, it does have a cooldown on it. The key to this is it does 2 things. One, it lets you see what gens are being worked on based off of what gens are blocked off. If the gen is white and blocked off, it means that you know survivors aren't working on those gens, so you can run over with something like a pop and go kick it afterwards. The other downside is if they're red, that means you know they're working on them, so you may want to go and chase them off of those gens. So it gives you a little bit of tracking, as well as it prevents them from working on those gens for 16 seconds. Yes, it's on a cooldown. Yes, you have to pick up a survivor, so it doesn't necessarily do anything. Like, if you're not able to down and pick up survivors, this perk becomes useless to you. However, it can provide a small bit of slowdown to the game now. I think it's a sneaky pick. So, Tinkering is an interesting pick. I've always thought this was a good perk, but I've lessened it less and less. What it does is, whenever a gen reaches 85%, you get a notification, and you get the undetectable effect for 12 seconds. So you completely remove Terror Radius, Red Stain, blah, blah, blah. This lets you sneak attack. The value that I have from Tinkering was I used to use it because I know, on most killers, you're not going to be able to get to that gen in time before the 85% goes off. So what I would do is, if it went off while I was in a chase, I'd get undetectable for a few seconds, which would let me confirm the hook I was on. It was basically what I called a trade perk, similar to what Bitter Murmur was, but instead, I would be trading a hook for a gen. Now, I like that trade a little bit better, than an aura reveal for a gen, or blocked vaults for a gen, which is why I put up with Tinker more. But at the end of the day, it's a trading perk. Most killers can't get to the generator in time to take advantage of it. And once the survivors know that you have it, they pretty much know how to counter it by just getting a gen to 85%, making sure they bum rush it before you can get over there in time. I wouldn't really call it a gen regression perk. I would call it can be a slowdown if you're playing a killer that can take advantage. And on a stealth killer, it's pretty much useless. Somebody like a Ghostface or a Wraith, the only real value that they get is they don't have to be in their power in order to get that. But moving on, Corrupt Intervention. A lot of people like Corrupt Intervention. I do not. I see Corrupt Intervention as a very bad perk for you to run as a killer. And I'll explain why. Corrupt Intervention blocks the 3 generators farthest from you when you spawn for 2 minutes at the start of the trial. Okay. In theory, the way this is supposed to work is it's supposed to work where for the first 2 minutes of the game, the survivors have a choice. They can either come to your side of the map and risk being killed and downed, or they can stay on their side of the map and they can do totems, chests, you know, just generally wait the perk out. As a killer, what it enables you to do is, on a killer that requires setup to be effective, this basically gives you 2 minutes to do one of 3 things. 1, setup. Somebody like a trapper or a hag who needs to set up their traps to be effective on a specific side of the map. 2 would be early game pressure. If you don't get at least 1 hook in that 2 minutes that Corrupt is up, the perk is completely wasted. And 3, it enables you to locate survivors. You know, you only have 4 gens to patrol at the beginning of the game because they can't be on the other 3 gens. Now, if you're not able to get it down, this perk becomes useless. This perk only has value if you are able to get a hook out of it, at least 1 hook out of it. If 2 minutes of the game has gone by, yes, the survivors haven't done anything, but you also haven't done anything. You haven't hooked anyone. So the game is no closer on your side to being complete as it is on their side to being complete. And now you've lost a perk slot. And people say, well, Noed is similar to that. Noed, you're basically playing with 3 perks the rest of the game until the endgame goes off, and then there may or may not be Noed. True, but it's still an exposed effect at the end of the game that most people usually don't know where that last totem is to cleanse it. This is at the beginning of the game. It's not a significant enough penalty because survivors just ignore it. That's what this perk does. Survivors are told ignore those 3 gens for 2 minutes. Go do something else. And you do not want that to happen. I mean, if you can take advantage, you can take advantage. But that's it. Next we have Discordance. So Discordance, in my opinion, is the premier gen detection perk. Anytime 2 or more survivors are working on the gen's aura is highlighted in yellow for 12 seconds. Now, Tier 1 is better than Tier 3, because it's 8-second notifications instead of 12-second notifications, but I digress. What Discordance does is it enables you to know what gens survivors are on. You know there's going to be 2 survivors on that gen, so you know that even if they get off and as you approach, they're nearby. It gives you a much more accurate description as to where the survivors are hiding. It's similar to Whispers, but it works on generators instead. Now, if the survivors just work on the gens individually, this perk has no value, so I understand that. However, this perk is the best way right now to track down what gen the survivors are on, especially for applying things like Pop or Thrilling Tremors. Another perk I want to talk about, minor, we're not going to talk a lot. Fire Up, this is an endgame motivator. This is a perk I run a decent amount. Basically, it buffs everything that doesn't really matter as the more gens get completed. It buffs picking up and dropping a survivor, which there is no other way to boost that speed, although it's not really that important. Pallet Breaking, which is Brutal Strength. You get this at 5 stacks, that's the same bonus at Brutal Strength. Gen Breaking, Brutal Strength, and Vaulting, which Bamboozle is 15% at Tier 3. Fire Up is 20% at 5 stacks on Tier 3. So, it's actually faster than Bamboozle. Just doesn't have the effect for the remainder of the trial. This bonus also stays with you. So these are rather insignificant things, but as the game goes on, it does help you with the intangibles of the game, so to speak. Something like having a built-in brutal strength on top of, you know, vaulting slightly faster. These are decent things because they let you cut down on the amount of time you're spending in certain loops the further you get into a game. Now, yes, you do have to lose 3 to 5 generators for this perk to become effective, but the benefit to it is it's going to save you more time at the end of the game where you need to save it. I'm not covering Thrill of the Hunt. I know it's a slow damper. I will give a minor shout out to Overwhelming Presence. If you don't have Franklin's Demise and you don't want to be Gen Rush, put on Distressing and put on Overwhelming Presence and force the survivors to at least not use toolboxes in your terror radius or they're going to die. I wish this perk was a bit stronger, but if you're afraid of toolboxes and you're looking for a I need to slow down toolboxes, Franklin's and Overwhelming are your best bet. Sloppy, I could. That's a healing speed, though. It's not really gens, so we're not going to cover that. There are 2 perks we will be covering. One is Surge. Now, Surge, in my opinion, was a shit perk, because it made it so that any survivor that went down to a basic attack within 32 meters of a generator caused it to explode. And it has a cooldown. The downside to this perk, well, what are they? A, the regression is not that great. 8% regression. That's not really a lot. B, most survivors usually don't go down right next to a generator unless they get grabbed off it or they're trying to bring the killer to their teammates. Either way, you can't really predict those circumstances when you go into a game. Now, the value of Surge would be if you could damage 2 gens at the same time. It's very rare to get 2 gens within 32 meters of each other. You're talking about something like a Meatpacking or a Hawkins, where you'll get, like, some gens are, like, right above each other, level-wise. Maybe you get that to apply. Another downside is it has a cooldown. It's a 40-second cooldown from the time you activate it. If you're a snowball killer, and you're trying to get multiple people down and slug, this perk doesn't become effective to you. The only way I see this perk really becoming effective is if you pair it with Thrilling Tremors. Instantly down someone, regress a gen by 8%, pick them up right away, block it off so they can't work on it, and then if a survivor does get on it, you can carry Pop. That's a lot of perks dedicated to just gen slowdown. The last perk we're going to talk about is Unnerving Presence, and this actually gets a small buff with the Ruin nerf. You see, under old Ruin, you needed survivors to hit great skill checks in order to pass Ruin, pretty much. And Unnerving Presence was bad because, well, if you're running Ruin and the skill checks are smaller, but the great skill checks aren't, you would get more great skill checks with Unnerving Presence than you would get misses. Really, this perk only benefits like Doctor or Huntress Lullaby users. Now, not so much. Now this perk has more value to it. Having a large terror radius and getting tiny skill checks, they're going to get more great skill checks. But they're going to miss more skill checks as well. The trade is, do you give up the great skill check for a missed skill check? And right now, because there's not really a lot of gen slowdown, I think this could be good for letting you know, hey, somebody's over here, go kill him. Other than that, I can't really recommend a lot of perks. The top perk on page 5, by the way, is going to be Surge. Your top perk on page 4 is going to be Discordance. The top perk on page 3 would be Pop Goes the Weasel. Your top perk on page 2 is going to be Huntress Lullaby. And the top perk on page 1 is going to be probably Blood Warden, because there's no real regression on, or it'd have to be Dying Light, because that's the only regression here. So anyways, that has been some tips and tricks for y'all. If you need some help with some Ruin, thank you for watching. Bye-bye.